going to continue a little bit on clauses and give you a little bit more of how they're going to work and the types of clauses we're going to work with. Also, very importantly, I'm going to give you a bad definition of a sentence, and you'll see why in a bit. First of all, we've already covered what a clause is. It has a subject and a verb. That's what a clause is. It just has a subject and a verb, but there's three types of clauses. Now, a common confusion is that if it has a subject and verb, it's a sentence. That is quite inaccurate. It could be a sentence, but it could be what's called a fragment, a different type. Really, in the end, to be a clause, you just have to have a subject and a verb. We'll get to the definition of a sentence in a bit. So the first type of clause is an independent clause. An independent clause is the first type. It has a subject and a verb, and the important characteristic about it is that it can stand alone. It can be, if you want it to be, a sentence. It doesn't have to be by itself a sentence, but it could be a sentence. So it has a subject and verb, and it could stand alone. That's what an independent clause is. In fact, it's the backbone of any English sentence. Okay? The next type of clause is called a dependent clause. It's called a dependent clause. Now, like all clauses, these have a subject and a verb. All clauses have that, and dependent clauses have a subject and verb, but they cannot be sentences. They cannot be sentences. Very important to keep that in mind. They have the subject and verb, but they can't be a sentence. It's not because they're lacking anything, but because they have something extra. It is not because they're lacking something, but because they have something extra, which is a subordinating conjunction. I will go much more into subordinating conjunctions and dependent clauses in Chapter 4, but I'm going to bring these up just so you realize that these can't be sentences. If we have something like, when Sally called Freddie, Sally called is a subject and verb. So it has its subject and verb. But it cannot be a sentence. It's a dependent clause. Why? Because it has that word when at the front. When Sally called, Harry. That when is what makes it into a dependent clause. If you take the when off, Sally called Harry, you have a sentence. So it's not that it's missing something, it's that it has something extra. It has that subordinating conjunction. It cannot be a sentence, even though it has a subject and verb. So that's the second type of clause. The third type of clause is the relative clause, which we'll get into in Chapter 4, but I just want to mention these now. They also have a subject and verb. Any clause has a subject and verb. Any clause has a subject and verb. The three main types are the independent, dependent, and relative. What's distinct about relative clauses is that they have a relative pronoun, such as who or which or whom, at the front of them. And those act as the subjects of those clauses. And we can place those inside of sentences to define people and things. That's what we use relative clauses for. I'm going to come back to both dependent clauses and relative clauses in Chapter 4. We'll get those in much more detail. The important thing for now is to understand that independent clauses are going to be the backbone of any English sentence. And now, coming to that bad definition, if you've heard definitions of sentences, almost all of them are really poor. You might be told that they must have a subject and verb. Well, that's half true and totally misleading, because you can have dependent clauses and relative clauses, which also have subjects and verbs. Really what they've done, when they've told you sentences have a subject and verb, they've really told you the definition of a clause. And this is, instead of being a sentence, is just a one way that we think of language. We think of language as words, phrases, and clauses. Okay? So they haven't defined a sentence by giving you subject and verb. They've defined clause. The other definition you'll hear is that it's a complete thought. This is a terrible definition of a sentence, because there's no understanding what exactly is a complete thought. How do you know when you see one? If somebody asks you, when is the baseball game, and you say on Tuesday, isn't on Tuesday a complete thought? Doesn't that tell you everything you want to know? Well, yes, it does. It's not a sentence, however, in standard written English. Instead, I'm going to give you another definition for now, and this is not a great definition. Okay? I'm going to say a sentence is an independent clause, so it has this first type of clause, an independent clause. And the second aspect of the definition is you say it's a sentence. This is very important because the grammatical part of the definition of a sentence is the independent clause. The stylistic part is that you say it is. You must give your approval to it. And this is very important because what you say a sentence is might not necessarily be what I say a sentence is. You might decide that your sentence should only have an independent clause and nothing else. I might want to add a couple of prepositional phrases. You might want to add a dependent clause. As long as you have that independent clause at the front, you're okay. You're in good shape. And if you look up the definition of a sentence, it can be quite problematic. In fact, most dictionaries have really vague definitions of sentences. They know it's a problem. In fact, you might remember this grammar book that I showed you early on, this comprehensive grammar. This is what they say a sentence is. The sentence is an indeterminate unit in the sense that it is often difficult to decide, particularly in spoken language where one sentence ends and another begins. In other words, they don't have a definition for you. They don't really know. It's indeterminate. So my definition, in keeping with the sense of bad grammar, is not a great definition. It's a bad definition. We'll get to the problems of it later on. But for now, understand that the backbone for standard written English is going to be that it has an independent clause. But then for you, you have to decide if that's going to stand as a sentence, and it's your decision if it is or if it needs to be developed more, or if it needs to be trimmed down, or if there needs to be a dependent clause or a relative clause added to it. As long as you have that independent clause, you've got it defined grammatically. You're okay. The rest is going to be about style. The definition of a sentence is both grammatical, has an independent clause, and then it's going to be stylistic. You say it is. You get to decide in stylistic matters. As long as you have that independent clause, you're free to do anything else you really want, in most cases. That is, right now, the best definition I can give you of a sentence. It has an independent clause, and then you're going to decide what it is. So for now, get the independent clauses down, make sure you understand them, because we're going to build everything else around that independent clause. Okay? Take care.